Police brutality against Black individuals is a persistent issue across the globe, disproportionately affecting marginalized communities. In many countries, law enforcement has historically been a tool for systemic oppression, and despite reforms, brutality continues to claim lives. In this video, we are going to examine the top 10 countries with the highest levels of police violence against Black people, and highlight the severity of the issue. We will highlight the issues like systemic racism, political issues, and the main causes of these brutalities. This video provides an analysis of historical context, current statistics, notable cases, and efforts for reform. 1. Brazil. Brazil has one of the highest rates of police killings in the world, with Black citizens being the primary victims. The country's history of slavery and systemic racism has led to a heavily militarized police force that disproportionately targets favelas, where a large number of Afro-Brazilian citizens reside. In 2019 alone, Rio de Janeiro police killed 1,814 people, with 80% of victims being Black. High-profile cases like the killing of 14-year-old Juan Pedro Matos Pinto in 2020 have fueled protests against police violence. Although reforms such as body cameras have been introduced, resistance from law enforcement and political leaders has hindered significant change. 2. United States. The United States has long been scrutinized for its racial disparities in policing. Black Americans are disproportionately targeted by law enforcement, with studies showing they are more likely to be stopped, searched, arrested, and subjected to excessive force. In 2023, Black people accounted for 26% of fatal police shootings, despite making up only 13% of the population. Cases like the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Michael Brown have sparked nationwide protests and global movements for police reform. Despite some progress, such as body cameras and de-escalation training, systemic issues and resistance to change persist. 3. United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, Black individuals are significantly more likely to be stopped and searched by police compared to their white counterparts. Between 2019 and 2020, Black people were 9 times more likely to be subjected to stop-and-search tactics. Institutional racism within the Metropolitan Police was highlighted in cases such as the 1993 murder of Stephen Lawrence, where mishandling of the case exposed systemic biases. More recently, incidents of excessive force and discriminatory policing practices continue to be reported. Although measures like body cameras and police accountability reviews have been implemented, distrust between Black communities and law enforcement remains high. 4. France. France has a long history of racial tensions between law enforcement and its Black and North African populations, many of whom are descendants of immigrants from former colonies. Police violence disproportionately affects these communities, with identity checks and aggressive policing often targeting Black youth. The 2016 death of Adama Traoré, a Black man who died in police custody, led to widespread protests and comparisons to the George Floyd case. Despite calls for reform, issues such as racial profiling and excessive force remain prevalent. The French government has introduced police body cameras, but activists argue that deeper structural changes are needed to address systemic racism in law enforcement. 5. Canada. Although Canada is often viewed as having a more progressive stance on human rights, its law enforcement agencies have a troubling history of racial profiling and excessive force against Black citizens. Studies show that Black Canadians are disproportionately subjected to police stops and use of force. In Toronto, Black residents make up only 8.8% of the population, but account for over 37% of police use of force incidents. The 2020 death of Regis Korchinski-Paquet, a Black woman who fell from a balcony during a police interaction, fueled concerns over police accountability. While Canada has implemented various police oversight measures, advocacy groups continue to push for greater transparency and systemic reforms. 6. South Africa. South Africa's history of apartheid has left a legacy of racialized policing, where Black communities continue to experience high levels of police violence. Reports show that law enforcement disproportionately uses excessive force against Black South Africans, particularly in impoverished areas. Cases such as the 2012 Marikana massacre, where police killed 34 striking mine workers, underscore the brutality of policing in the country. Recent incidents, such as the 2020 killing of Collins Kosa during COVID-19 lockdown enforcement, further highlight systemic issues. Despite legal frameworks aimed at police accountability, excessive force and corruption remain rampant, with many calling for independent oversight of law enforcement agencies. 7. Australia. In Australia, the Indigenous Black population faces severe police brutality and systemic discrimination. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are significantly overrepresented in the criminal justice system and experience high rates of deaths in custody. Data from the Australian Institute of Criminology shows that Indigenous Australians are 12 times more likely to die in police custody than non-Indigenous individuals. The 2019 death of Kumanjai Walker, a 19-year-old Aboriginal man shot by police, sparked national outrage. While initiatives such as independent police watchdogs exist, critics argue that these measures have failed to curb the disproportionate violence faced by Indigenous communities. 8. Colombia. In Colombia, Afro-Colombians experience systemic discrimination and police brutality, often in the form of violent crackdowns during protests. The country's history of internal conflict has resulted in a highly militarized police force, with Black communities frequently targeted in anti-crime operations. Reports from human rights organizations highlight that Afro-Colombians are disproportionately subjected to arbitrary arrests and excessive force. The 2021 national protests against police violence saw a significant number of Black demonstrators injured or killed by law enforcement. Although Colombia has introduced police reform measures, such as training programs on human rights, systemic racism within the police force remains a major concern. 9. Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic has a long history of racial discrimination, with Black Dominicans and Haitian immigrants facing frequent police violence. Reports indicate that darker-skinned individuals are more likely to be stopped, detained, and subjected to excessive force. Police raids targeting Haitian communities have led to widespread allegations of human rights abuses. Cases such as the 2019 death of a Black Haitian man in police custody highlight the brutality faced by Black individuals. While international organizations have urged the Dominican government to address these issues, progress has been slow, and racial profiling continues to be a significant problem. 10. Jamaica. Jamaica has one of the highest rates of police killings in the Caribbean. With Black men being the primary victims, Amnesty International reports that law enforcement officers frequently use excessive force, particularly in marginalized communities. In 2020, the Independent Commission of Investigations, INDECOM, recorded over 100 police-related deaths, with many cases involving allegations of extrajudicial killings. The case of Mario Dean, who died in police custody in 2014, remains a symbol of police brutality in Jamaica. While oversight agencies like INDECOM exist, activists argue that impunity for police misconduct remains a major challenge. Police brutality against Black people is a global crisis that demands urgent attention. Despite efforts at reform, systemic racism and excessive force continue to plague law enforcement agencies in many countries. While some nations have introduced policies to improve police accountability, progress remains slow, and public trust in law enforcement is low. Addressing this issue requires comprehensive legal reforms, independent oversight, and sustained activism to ensure justice for victims of police violence. The fight against racialized policing is far from over, and continued efforts are necessary to bring about meaningful change.